Welcome everyone. My name is Paul Draus. I'm a professor of sociology here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. And this event tonight is brought to us by a couple of different sources have helped to sponsor this event. The most important one is the Don Levin Speaker Fund. Now, Don Levin was a professor of sociology, a longtime professor of sociology here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn, long before my time. I've been here about 12 years. Don Levin had retired by the time I was here, but he had a kind of a legendary status around the department. He was a longtime chair of the department. And Don was known for his love of controversial topics and debates. And his son, Mark Levin, who's now a movie producer in Hollywood, had fond memories of coming to the U of M Dearborn campus and being involved in some of the on-campus debates that would take place here, of which his father was a part. And so the Speaker Fund was established to kind of in the spirit, in Don Levin's spirit, as a kind of a forum for topics of discussion that were both, sociological, as he was a sociologist, but also which were important at the kind of the cutting edge of conflicts and issues in the world around us, which of course this is what sociology is all about. It's trying to understand one's place in the larger world. And this is an exciting time that we're living in. It's also in many ways a frightening time, I understand, but it is an exciting time. And so we're very pleased tonight to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Waverly Duck. Dr. Duck is a native Detroiter. He was born and raised in the city of Detroit. He earned his PhD at Wayne State University, the other university here in Metro Detroit, in sociology. He is an urban ethnographer, and the work he's going to be talking about tonight is based upon years of research, I think about 7 years of research, close to 10 years of research in a small northeastern city. That's how we do things in sociology. We don't tell you exactly where our research was conducted sometimes in order to preserve the identities of the people involved in that research. The results of that research were published in the form of a book called No Way Out, Precarious Living in the Shadow of Poverty and Drug Dealing. That was published in 2015 by the University of Chicago Press. It's available on Amazon.com. I'm sorry I don't have a stack of the books here today. It was something that occurred to me later. We should have arranged to have a stack of books here to sell. But I want to read you a little bit of a review of that book by which was written by Peter Moskos, who is a criminologist, a former Baltimore police officer, is now a criminologist at John Jay College in New York. No Way Out by sociologist Waverly Duck is a story of a neighborhood, a poor neighborhood, a black neighborhood, a neighborhood with public drug dealing, and also a stable neighborhood. Somewhere between macro theory and micro interaction between the urban ghetto and global capitalism, Duck gradually got to know a neighborhood from a variety of perspectives over many years. Duck has written a gem of a meso-level ethnography describing in great and touching detail the people who live poor and black in the semi-urban, post-industrial, suburban decay that is all too typical in America. And so here in Dearborn, Michigan, in the Detroit metro area, I think the issues that Dr. Duck has confronted in his work are very, very relevant to us as well. And so I hope you will join me in welcoming him, Dr. Waverly Duck. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to get comfortable because I'm going to tell a number of stories. And also, I am beyond flattered. I'm a bit overwhelmed because it's great to come home and to get that gracious introduction and to be in front of this group of people. I think there's a part of me where I think my work, and this book in particular, is an homage to cities like Detroit and Cleveland and the Camden, New Jerseys. But I also think that, one of the reasons why I started to do this work in the first place was trying to figure out solutions and understand what things work and what things are not working. And to, privilege the knowledge, the local knowledge that people have. Now, I promised that I would leave my computer down here, but I'm just going to move it up here, so I'm sorry. Hopefully this won't create too many problems. If I could get it to stand still over my phone. So, I think it'll work out at some shape or form if I can do this. Okay, I want to show you a picture. Does anybody know where this picture is from? Warren. Anybody else? Eastside. Who said Eastside? Yes, this is where I grew up in Detroit. I grew up on Lyford Street off of Van Dyke on the east side of Detroit. And this is the state of the neighborhood where I grew up, the neighborhood where I was born, where my family grew up. My brothers went to Kettering High School. I attended Lynch Elementary and Law Elementary after I left. But there's something very beautiful about this neighborhood. There's something very quiet and telling that this could happen to an American city. And what I'll tell you about how my family came to Detroit, and it's somewhat ironic that I'm in Dearborn, Michigan. But in 1925, 1926, Henry Ford sent emissaries down to Starksville, Columbia, and Tupelo, Mississippi to recruit workers to work in the factories. And this became the first pathway that my family ended up in Detroit. And then around about 1964, because of a lot of the conditions in the South, my mother and my stepfather moved to Detroit. So between 1924 and 1964, you can see this huge migration to Detroit. And we lived in this neighborhood on the east side of Detroit. For those of you, there was a Faygo factory, Better Made potato chips, where it was made off of this factory on Gratiot. And there was this point where Van Dyke and Gratiot would connect. But this was the neighborhood where I grew up. And if you can imagine, I'm one of 8 kids, one of 8. Now, my family, they were farmers who lived in the South. And then when they moved to Detroit, I can honestly say none of my siblings have no more than 2 to 3 kids. But when my family moved to Detroit, it was normal to have that many children. And then, my father and my stepfather both worked at the factory. They both worked at Chrysler, not far from here. And actually if you look over here, that's the Detroit City Airport, but that used to be a Chrysler plant on the other side, and we used to play in those fields. And what was beautiful about the community where I grew up was that, it was a neighborhood of distant relatives in the form of cousins or people who were from those places like Starksville and Tupelo and Meridian, Mississippi. And I'm number 6 in the line of 8 kids. And if you can imagine, by the time the 6th one come along and he's a boy, I had a lot of autonomy and control. So I would, when I was 5, I would make this dramatic declaration, like, I'm sick of this, I'm gonna run away, and I would get on my big wheel, and I would just leave. And I was directionally challenged, and I remember I would get tired, and I would just go and knock on a neighbor's door, and they can look at my face and tell who I was related to. This is how tight that neighborhood was. And if you weren't related to everybody in the neighborhood, chances are with 7 other brothers and sisters, that they are either in class or in school with somebody who's older in the neighborhood. What ultimately ended up happening, and I think it was a devastating effect, and I think it shapes why I decided to do this, work on this particular project, why I'm a sociologist. It's pretty much my life is a series of trying to figure out mysteries. Was when crack cocaine came on the scene. Now there's a couple things. So you gotta pair crack cocaine with deindustrialization. So to give you an idea, my father was laid off from the factory, and we used to do carpentry, paint building, shovel snow, what people call hustling. But when those factories would lay off, the entire neighborhood would be laid off. And so if you can think about what happened in the factories, was first there was sort of this movement towards automation, then the factories went south, and then they went further south, and then they went abroad. And then in the early 80s, as this sort of turmoil is happening, oil prices are, up and fluctuating all over the place, this new drug comes on the scene. And crack cocaine was amazing. Not amazing in terms of a new drug, but it was amazing in terms of the amount of wealth that was flowing through my neighborhood. And I remember that there was these huge 4th of July parties. And then by, I want to say, we're talking like July, by October we start seeing the addicts. My brother, who was in and out of prison for 30 years, became addicted to crack cocaine. Numbers of people in this neighborhood. And I think the violence that sort of was related to the drug trade and deindustrialization in terms of the decline of this neighborhood sort of created this situation. And so I think, in trying to, this is my elementary school and my middle school. Kettering closed a number of years ago. I graduated from Osborne. For those of you who are Detroiters, it's still open, but it's on the list of closures. But this was a thriving community. And this was a community that shaped my thinking. So I get my PhD. I want to save the world. But I also want to do work that speaks to a certain sensibility in terms of experience. So I want to do qualitative work and I want to be an ethnographer. Now, ethnography is the systematic study of culture. Now, ethnography and anthropology is subtly different than ethnography and sociology because our theoretical traditions are different and our relationships to other types of methods are different. But there was this professor named Elijah Anderson who had this book that I thought was exquisite called A Place on the Corner. And I remember thinking to myself, that's the type of book I wanted to write. And so I moved to Philadelphia to work with him. I got a job at a community college. And a part of this relationship of working with Elijah Anderson, I had the opportunity to work with him on a death penalty case. Now, if you can imagine, you have this prominent professor, and someone was coming to him, a group of defense attorneys were coming to him and saying to him, we want to use your work for mitigating circumstances to spare somebody's life. And he looks at me and he says to me, asked me if I wanted to work on this project. And so I agree. And this is the type of work that I want to do. And so I go to meet this guy who's in the federal prison. And he is being charged with being the head of a drug gang. So conspiracy to commit murder by being the head of a drug gang and murdering a rival drug dealer. Now, prior to this, I studied interactions in social settings. I work on everything from looking at studies about health and masculinity. I'm even doing work on autism right now. So this was something I was interested in, but purely as a volunteer. So I go to meet this kid, this young man. He's 22. And he tells me this fantastic story. Fantastic in the sense that, given my upbringing, that I couldn't process, that he gives this story about his pathway into the drug trade. So he's forced to hold a package at the age of 7, which gives him a pathway to work as a lookout for the dealers all the way up until the age of 11. Then he's on the corner selling by 11. Then by 16, he's independent. He has his own operation. And then at 22, he's in prison where they're seeking the death penalty. My job as an ethnographer was to collect data about this community. So I end up going, and my first day in this neighborhood, everything he described was going on. I could see the, exquisite networks of these kids, working in teams selling drugs. I could see the customers, where they were coming in, where they were leaving. And I was fascinated by this. But that wasn't the thing that fascinated me the most. I was fascinated by the resiliency of the people who lived in this neighborhood. That here, the neighborhood where I grew up, no longer exists. But there are people who still identify based on their southern relatives, people who still identify based on the elementary, middle, and high school where they graduated from, and these familial networks were still intact. And so it became this thing after this case was over. And he ultimately ended up getting life in prison without the possibility of parole. Could I tell the story of this community? And the other thing that was really important to me is that books about, the literature is saturated with books about places like Philadelphia, New York, LA. But there are very few books about the smaller places, the Camden, New Jerseys, the Youngstown, Ohio's, the Ferguson, Missouris. And so I wanted to write a book about just the different dynamics that smaller places have compared to large cities. So I decided to write this book. And it is a book based on a series of mysteries. So the first chapter of this book is how I became involved in this guy's case. The second chapter of the book is the guy's story from his perspective. The third chapter, I wanted to see if I understood like the economics of the drug trade, could I provide alternatives for kids in terms of, if I could get the sense what they were making, could I provide alternatives and understand the drug trade? Then there were other mysteries. Like this was a predominantly white neighborhood. So how did it transition from a white middle class space to a poor black space? And then there were other things that I was curious about. How does violence function in the space when everybody's known? There are very few anonymous actors, and how do people within the community make sense of violence versus people outside the community? What about information, gossip, snitching? How does information work? And are there different types of information? Can certain types of information keep you safe? And then the rest of the book looks at the challenges that poor women and poor men are facing. And then I make recommendations that policymakers should really pay attention to how people are navigating these multiple systems of control. And when I say multiple systems of control, that I would make the argument that every few years there are these sort of street corner men books of this type. But in the past 30 years, we've witnessed drastic changes in welfare reform. We've witnessed drastic changes in how we do public housing and even the idea or the concept of affordable housing and the Section 8 model. We've changed the ways that we fund education systems and moving from sort of, we have this sort of testing model, but also the privatization of schools with the charter school model. We have interesting challenges in terms of mass incarceration, how we do things like child support. So there are a number of these things that we have to pay attention to that's happening at one moment in time that would sort of create a condition for this book. Now, with that amazing setup, I don't think it's amazing, but I gave you a lot of information. Let's get into the work. So, what did I do? I'm an urban ethnographer. I systematically study culture. And what's great about ethnography is that it's one of the few methods for now where it requires a physical body in whatever activity that you're exploring. So the neighborhood is predominantly African American and Latino. I do, as an ethnographer, we do it all. So there's interviews, there's observations, both passive and active, and this was over a period of 7 years. Now, Paul was really generous because I will say that it will never take me 7 years to do a study again, but I think I was at a transitional point in my life where there were stories that were really important for me to tell, and I had the luxury of doing this job over a 7-year period. I started off as an expert witness, and then I was a community organizer, then I was tutoring after-school programs. I even worked in a community garden. I was conflict resolution counselor, day camp counselor, and these were all voluntary activities. I didn't have money to pay people, but I had my free labor. And this is something that's really valuable across space and time. I think what's interesting here, as I look and I'm reading off this list, is how much there is a concern for the youth. And that the placement of me within this community had a lot to do with, spaces that were created because there seemed to be a concern about the youth. Now, I am studying this community that has an embedded drug trade, but there's also a permanent police presence. And so I'm curious, how do people make sense of sort of the embedded drug scene in their community, but also the police presence in their neighborhood. And how do you, constitute, or what does it mean to be in a community with these two things that are present? Now, every good piece of work at some point should have some theoretical grounding. Now, I will say that, the way that the book is written to appeal to three sensibilities. The common person off the street, that I want somebody to be able to pick up this book and get it. The book is also sociological, and I'm engaging in a lot of arguments within the discipline. But I also wanted the people who I studied to recognize their stories. There is a history in ethnography and for a lot of disciplines that sort of present people as either more than or less than. They're either more pathological or less pathological. They're more disorganized or less disorganized. There's a high cultural poverty, a low cultural poverty. High social solidarity, low solidarity. I wanted to do a study where no one was going to be presented as more than or less than, but we would understand people on their terms, on their own terms. And I think what's really important is making sure that we understand the history of people and places. We should also equally understand that, people's biographies are important. That the one thing that you're expert on is your story. No one can tell you anything other about you than you. You're an expert on your life experience. But also paying attention to structural issues like deindustrialization. Structural issues like, low-wage service sector. The lack of livable wages that are available. Thinking about concepts and ideas about race, gender, sexuality, and class, and how all of these things sort of play out in an interaction. I decided to use this argument by Goffman, and it's a bit wordy, called the interaction order argument, but I will simplify for you. But if you can think about local rules that are agreed upon by a group of people, workings can easily be viewed as the consequences of a system of enabling conventions in the sense of ground rules for a game, provisions of a traffic code, rules of syntax of a language, in a much more simplified way. What are those local relationships that you build in spaces? What are the behaviors that are learned and recognized? And how does time play out? The time of day, the time to do the activity, the time in terms of history. How do you factor that all in? And then in addition to looking at practices that are sanctioned, what are some of the rewarded practices? And the context and situation matters. And I think these are all things that I think are really important in understanding why people do some of the things they do. In terms of why I think this book is important, I think every few years we speculate about what's going on in a lot of communities. And I think it would be offensive for me to come from the University of Pittsburgh and say to you all, at the University of Pittsburgh, we have it all figured out. And I have a set of prescriptions that you all should follow, and implement right away because we know what's best for you at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, how offensive that would be if I didn't talk to any of you, if I didn't meet with any of the faculty. All of these things are much more complex. And what I'm saying is that, all places are not created equally. The issues of a smaller community versus a larger community are quite different. And they're qualitatively different. And so that we should not only speak to the people, but I also think we shouldn't assume that we know what's best for the people who live in these spaces every day. Now, in terms of talking about the space itself, in 1950, it was a city with around about 60,000 people. By 2014, it was around about 16,500 people. 50% of the jobs were held by residents, 17% of jobs held by residents in this space. 2 manufacturing plants closed in the town where I did my work. And if you can think about it, 39,000 workers. Now, I will say this, that as an homage to my father and my stepfather, these were 2 men who worked at Chrysler, who were able to support, there were never 8 kids in the house at once. But there were about 6 of us, off of his salary from Chrysler. So if you can think about minimum wage jobs, and because you have a surplus of workers, you can do all types of background checks, substance abuse screenings, and ask for credentials. In terms of the racial makeup of this place, it's around about 36,000 African Americans, 13% European American, and 10% Latino. Unemployment was around about 25%. Poverty was around about 23% while I was doing a lot of the field work, but 35% of children live in poverty in this place. And these are the poverty rates that are very similar for both Black and Latino kids today. What was great about doing this study, or maybe it wasn't so great about it, but it was like this composed neighborhood. And 747 houses, $17,000 was the average value of a house, a number of abandoned and vacant lots, vacant and abandoned houses. And it was close to the expressway, but I think these two details are really important. Not only it was a powder cocaine market, so it wasn't weed, it wasn't heroin, it wasn't meth. And most of the customers were predominantly white in this space. This is what the neighborhood looked like prior to the building of the expressway. And this is what it looks like today. So you can literally get off the expressway, go into the neighborhood, buy your drugs, and then get back on the expressway and be on your way. And this is what the neighborhood looks like when it was first built. And what I'm trying to understand is how did the neighborhood transition from this group of people to this group of people? And how people came to live in this space. Now, I've blocked out some of the faces of the kids, but this is what the neighborhood looks like today. And these are some of the kids who I worked with. And so you can get a sense of the space. But like with all communities, it's not a monolithic community. That there are people who take great pride in their homes, and there are people who are committed to living in this community. Now, I'm going to introduce you to a group of people who live in this neighborhood. And one of the people I want to introduce you to is a missionary who's lived in this neighborhood for 7 years. And remember how I told you about that within this neighborhood, everybody understands the rules. And after living in this neighborhood for 7 years, even she, as someone who's white and in her 20s, as an outsider, even understand the rules of this neighborhood. And so I'm asking, the initial goal of this question was, people talk about this being like this dangerous, whatever, ruthless place. But nothing, from our interactions, you've told me nothing has ever happened to you in the 7 years that you've been there. So what does it mean, or how does it feel to live in this neighborhood? So this is her account. It is horrible, and you shouldn't do that. But I think, I think the point here is that she's pointing out, what whiteness means in that space, and that a lot of people who are coming there are there to buy drugs. And as a resident, she wished she can curb or stop this problem. But following up, I asked her, living in this community, has anything bad ever happened to you? And this is the account that she gives. And I want to sort of juxtapose this because I'm going to introduce you to some of the people who lived in this community most of their lives. So there are a couple of things. So she expands the definition of what it means to be white in this neighborhood. So your cops or church or you're buying drugs. The other thing that I think is really important was that she felt so comfortable that she could challenge. As a member of that community, that she can challenge and go to the adult leader and say, these are what my expectations are. I think the other thing, in terms of who's supposed to be in this space and who's not to be, or who's not supposed to be in this space, that whenever you hear something added to a category, so not only calling her a bitch, but calling her a white bitch, pointing out that you don't belong here, and being able to say, because I live in this neighborhood, I have certain rights and privileges, but I'm also aware of the contradictions, whether it has to do with people who are buying drugs, or whether it has to do with people who are a part of law enforcement, or whether it has to do with people who are a part of the church. So as an outsider, she can claim membership to this community. But also she's aware of the contradictions that her identity poses in this particular space. But she's aware that there's this sort of salient order that she understands by being a member in this space. I want to introduce you to another participant who has a different take on what's going on in the neighborhood. And so I was asking him, how do you make sense of not only the drug trade, but the police presence in the community? And so he gives this elaborate explanation of what he believes is going on. Now, what I want to say to you, and I want you to take this as, to trust me on this and say, whether what he says is true or not is not relevant in so much that he believes this, and that he has practices that he's witnessing, that he's attributing to these behaviors. So, I can believe, is it Ebonie? Am I right? So I can believe, that, Ebonie, that we're friends based on our earlier interaction. But you may have a different requirement for friendship that goes beyond 5 minutes in an interaction. What I'm saying is, if he believes that this is real, it's real in its consequences. But what he is pointing to is some practices that he's noticed in the neighborhood. Regardless of who you are, I want to say regardless of who you are, this statement, in terms of his sense-making, adds to sort of a local knowledge. This is how he's making sense of law enforcement in the neighborhood. And I think what's even more important about this, and when we talk about things like trust and legitimacy, that what's informing his observations? Where is he getting this information from? Now, for me as a researcher, I hear what he's saying, and so I want to investigate more. So I start shadowing a patrol officer for 2 years and ask her what types of policing goes on in this neighborhood, and what is it that he's talking about. It's important that we really understand how smaller municipalities are funded, in terms of places when the tax base has been eroded, in terms of the property tax base, and how do we fund things like city government and law enforcement. I think this becomes significant. But what she told me, that there was community policing of neighborhood patrols, and then there's problem-solving policing where there's a focus on drug dealing, prostitution, or gangs. And then they have a way of doing hotspot policing based on places that have visible open-air drug markets and street crimes. And then they use data and do sort of crime analysis and figure out where to have more surveillance. Now, but he is saying that, there's this larger crimes are not being solved, they're riding around here and getting petty. So one of my participants was arrested for tickets, unpaid tickets. And I think this is a phenomenon that I've seen all over the country, that there's almost a neo-debtor's prison on how these things work. And so how these things can make life even worse. So let's listen. Now, $2,200 worth of tickets, suspended license, no car insurance. What is the worst thing you possibly can do in those circumstances in a car? I don't know why I'm looking at you like you're because you're a homicide detective. Say kill somebody.
Yeah, that was going to be my answer, but I was going to ask you to rephrase the question because maybe I didn't understand.
Yeah, let's say I'm in a car, I'm driving without a license and without car insurance. I guess those are horrible things already. But what would make that situation worse? Speeding. Let's say she hit a man. What's going to happen to her? I'm going to ask you.
She's going to jail if she sticks around.
All right. Now, there's one part of this where, those minor infractions can, lead and, cause all types of, disruptions in life. But there is something I think is very significant and very important. Now, the fact that she decided to stay, given the circumstances, I think is very telling, and it speaks to who we are as a society, as a country, I think is very special. But I also think it speaks to whether she decided to go against expectations because she stayed instead of leaving, but it also captures that law enforcement. And I think this is what we really forget about, is that they have discretion in terms of how they're going to deal with these issues. And then it makes us think about, under what circumstances do we employ law enforcement to use more discretion at these early interactions? Now, even something as serious as this, and I think it's really telling, and I think it's really important, because I don't think it's this sort of binary, this good cop, bad cop narrative. I think it's much more complex. I think it's a structural issue. I think they're sort of situational issues, but I think here, to sort of employ people to have autonomy and control in how they think about these things, and the implications of what this would have done to somebody's life, I think is very sort of telling. Now, I do want to point out that the drug trade is very salient, but it's present in this neighborhood. And I want to come back to our missionary, because remember I said that everybody understands the rules in this neighborhood. What do you think the missionary is going to do when she finds a brick of cocaine? All right, let's find out. No more mysteries for you. This is really elegant. So she has to figure out which officer she trusts. So this becomes another issue about how we build these healthy relationships in the community. So she waits for 2 weeks before she does anything, and hoping that the people will come back and get it. And once she figures out that she has to get rid of it, she has to decide how she's going to cooperate with law enforcement. And I think it's, again, very telling in how people go through these sort of, what do I want to say? These sort of pathways to sort of figure out what's appropriate based on sort of living and understanding the rules in this community. But also that there are some officers who are seen as being more legitimate and more trustworthy than others. And that people, when they're in a bind, and she's not the only one, who seek them out to cooperate with him. Now, unfortunately, this work happened a lot before the numbers of shootings that we've seen in the news, whether it's the Philando Castile, the Eric Garner, Oscar Grant, or Kia Boyd. The list goes on and on. Well, while I was doing my field work, there was a shooting, and it was a 21-year-old unarmed black man, and he was shot in the back while fleeing the police. The officer was put on leave. Investigation found that the officer did not use excessive force. But what was interesting here is that the community understood almost how this would play out, and even understood what would be the potential responses from some of the guys who worked on the corner. And so you have residents who are struggling to make sense of what just happened. So this resident, as I'm doing my interviews, trying to understand this community, tells the story, and I'm in the heat of it, I'm in the thick of it. The brother does an interview with one of the local newspapers, and he gives this following account. Everyone knows that if anyone other than a cop shoots and kills someone, they're arrested and held in jail while things are sorted out. We are frustrated that only because the police are involved and he's allowed to continue to work. We don't completely understand the investigation process, who's conducting it, how long it will take, or what to expect. I wish that investigators would come in from the outside who have no ties to the community and would only work with facts and what's right or wrong. There's not a lot of confidence that the investigation will uncover the truth. Why do almost all ex-cons in Bristol Hill who've paid their debt to society never seem to get a second chance? Why can't a troubled cop come into our town and get a job, but I can't go to that town and get a job? Now, again, I think the frustrations that are within this account, where you have the frustrations with the investigation process, you have the frustrations with the economy, but I think the other subtle thing is that there are very few unknown actors, that people follow this particular officer on Facebook, they have relationships with this community, that there's something very special about this place in the face of some of these tragedies, and even how people in this community memorialize each other. And seeing these elaborate memorials of somebody standing on top of a garbage can doing spray painting to sort of create these memorials for people who died in the space. But, you know, I've painted this picture, but there are people who love living in this community. I have a mom who lives on the east side of Detroit and refuses to move. You know, can't get her to move. And I somehow wanted to understand what other people dealing with this. And I spoke to the daughter of one of the residents, and I was like, you know, why does your mom stay in this neighborhood? Why does she stay? Why isn't she moving? Now, this lovely Southern woman cooked me something to eat, and while I'm sitting at our table, I ask her, the mom, you know, why do you stay here? I want to wrap up this talk so that we can have a dialogue with these three speakers? Three respondents. I want to say, as a sociologist, I think it's really important that the interaction order is just a way of understanding sort of complexities of communities, but this is an argument I'm using in other aspects of my work, whether I'm studying autism, whether I'm studying, you know, institutional settings, whether I'm studying communities. Residents have a mixed feeling about sort of, you know, the sanctions and the use of discretion amidst about larger concerns about trust and legitimacy. And I think we need to figure out, like, you know, what is the particular role of law enforcement in small municipalities, you know, and how are people making sense of that presence? And I think, again, the last thing I would say is that thinking about when citizens have legal recourse and that there are sanctions, and how does accountability work in these spaces as well. And I think this sort of shapes trust, this sort of shapes how we think about legitimacy, but it also shapes the local understanding that people have that's sort of influencing, not determining how they move about in everyday life. I want to play one last clip that I think summarizes how people feel about this community. And I think it captures not only my sentiments about the place, but also how a lot of the people who live in this space feel about their neighborhood. I'm going to end there. At least I'm going to try to end there. Over here,
Yeah, go ahead.
do
Grab a
some
seat right here.
stuff.
And we have, we're very fortunate to have a great panel to respond to the presentation. I had a few responses of my own with thinking, in listening and watching. I did my field work in Chicago, and like a lot of it on the west side of Chicago in the 1990s, and a lot of the things you're saying really struck home, but also the work we've done here in Detroit. The part about the woman saying you have to dynamite me out. We did an interview, I think last summer on the east side of Detroit. This house kind of stands out in the middle of the block, like this really well-kept little house, almost like in a sea of like grass and there's houses, burned out houses, the stuff that people associate with Detroit. But we were really interested in who was living in this house, and we knew some of the other guys in the community, and they said, oh yeah, that's, Mrs. So-and-so, and that's her daughters live there and all that. And we went over there one day and we just met them, and they were very, very friendly. They invited us in, we did an interview there. And we asked her about that question, do you ever think about leaving? She's like, no, she fell in love with that house the first moment she saw it. She bought it like the same day back in well, I'm looking at Julie because she was there with me. And Paris was there too, right? Was it like in the 50s or something she bought it? And she said, I'm never leaving this house. So that's really, really important, to understand community is a complex thing, and then, people put judgments on a place just like they put judgments on people. But those judgments never sum up what that place is or who those people are. And that's why ethnography, I think, is so important. But I think I put this panel together thinking about that question that you started off with, which is, why do we do this as sociologists? I mean, part of the reason is because we're curious and there are mysteries we want to understand what's going on. But on the other hand, we want to do something about it too. We want to think about what is it that we can do if we see that there's something that could be better or people's lives are being impacted in a negative way. We want to try to understand how we can do something about that. And that gets us kind of the question of policy. What do we do, right? And so I think the panel that I've invited here today is very well positioned to speak, both to respond to the presentation, but also to speak to that question of what do we do. And so I'm going to introduce them one at a time. And then when I'm going to introduce you, you're going to come on up, all right? And I'm going to introduce Detective Khary Mason from Detroit Police Department. He's a homicide detective. He's been with the Detroit Police Department for about 20 years. Lately, he's been working on some other projects, though. He just got back from Kenya. He's been working on a program called the International Volunteer Children's Photography Program, a program called Capturing Belief. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Khary? And he's working with a photojournalist from the Detroit Free Press named Romain Blanquart. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I met Romain and Khary inside the Detroit Reentry Center. So I met him inside a correctional facility and instantly was struck by his insights and the things he talked about. He's also a storyteller, so this is a good combination. And I want to invite up Ebonie Byndon-Fields. She's a professor of criminal justice at Wayne State University. She's also a lawyer, so she's a double threat, and a social worker, too. For 7 years, she worked as a social worker. She also spent some time in the Third Circuit Court, and she teaches in our Inside Out Prison Exchange program here in Michigan. So she's a part of the theory group that we started at, we started at Ryan Correctional Facility, now it's at Macomb Correctional Facility. So I'm very glad Ebonie can be here. And finally, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Bishop Daryl Harris. Bishop Harris is faith-based coordinator for the Detroit CeaseFire program. He's also a lifelong resident of Detroit, as is Khary Mason. I don't know, Ebonie? No, okay. So I just asked them all to attend because I thought they would be very interested in the talk, and I'd be very interested in what their thoughts might be. So I'm actually going to ask each one of them to maybe share some of their thoughts and insights, reactions to the talk, and then when each panelist has made a statement, we will open up the floor for questions, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion with the audience here today. So thank you. Should we start with, okay. Yes.
I guess I'll start first. I found that a lot of what Dr. Duck said was true. I grew up here in the city of Detroit on the west side. Started out in a two-parent family, and when I was 7 years old, there was a break in my mom and dad's relationship. And she had to struggle working two jobs in order to provide the type of life that we were used to and that she was used to. But when a relationship breaks up and the remaining parent attempts to continue economically the way you had done before, it removes that remaining parent from the household, and the children are left behind. And by the time the parent realizes what's going on, certainly some of your children are a lot older. They've been left to their own vices and they've made mistakes. And sometimes you lose children along the way. So my younger brother, shortly after I got out of the police academy, killed himself. And it had to do with things that happened when there was nobody around in the home. He took my mother's car out with some of my friends. He brought the car back and he filled the car up with water. He was a kid. He was like 12, 13. She gave him up as a ward to the state, and he went to a place called Maxi Olympic. And some very unsavory things happened to my brother. And when he got out, I didn't understand him. He felt like the world owed him something. And certainly, I didn't feel I owed him anything because I didn't understand the situation. And I got him a job, and things just sort of went downhill from there. When When I was in middle school, it was the first time I saw somebody get killed. I went to Ludington Middle School. When I was 12 years old, I saw a guy come outside a house holding a baby. And he had a conversation with two men. And those two men began to argue with the young man that was holding the child. One man went back to the car, and the driver ran back to the car. The passenger pulled a long gun and shot the man holding the baby. He also shot the baby. They both fell to the ground, and the car sped off. That was the first time I saw somebody get killed. The last time in my life, prior to being the police, that I thought about being the police was when I was in the 4th grade. Police and firefighters and architects and doctors came to my school for career day. From then on, it was a fleeting thought, and the older I got, the less I thought about it. When I was 20, I had my first child. And my wife sat down next to me. I had been cooking for 4 years, and she said, this is not going to pay the bills anymore. What do you think about being the police? I thought I could protect my family. I get to carry a gun, and I could also tell people what to do. When you get out of the academy, you are Superman or Superwoman. And though you've grown up in a city with your relatives and friends and everybody that looks like you, you are indoctrinated into a world that is new to you. And for a certain period of time, you wearing that suit of armor it is impenetrable, and a lot of police don't shake that suit of armor, and sometimes we forget how to treat people. The first place I was assigned was the 9th Precinct, and I worked in the 9th Precinct from 1998 to 2008. And while I was there, I underwent a transformation. I had people in my ear who turned me from superhero to social worker, who would tell me, hey, if you learn how to talk to people, you get a lot more out of them, right? Some of these people walk around with not a penny in their pocket. They got mouths to feed at home, and they got a woman at home telling them, hey, we need food, we need money. And there's only certain things that they know how to do in order to get that money. The way you talk to those people can cause a fight, or it can diffuse a situation. So I traveled through the department, and at the time I had, it was 2013, so that was 3 years ago. I had 16 years on the department. I got sent to homicide. And while I was at homicide, my daughter was born. And I began to realize that for 20 years, almost, I've been locking up younger versions of myself. And I didn't want to do that anymore. So I wondered, it doesn't matter how many people you lock up. If you lock up somebody for the most egregious crime, they get life. And a lot of times, those people get out. When they get out of prison, they are going to be interacting with your relatives, your loved ones, your children, your friends. They have had to survive their entire lives. Your children have not had to do that. You've given your children the best that society has to offer. When given the choice to do the right thing or the wrong thing, your children are usually going to do the right thing. That person and that group of people that we call the criminal class are going to do whatever they have to do to survive the situation that they are in. And your kids will suffer at that expense. So one of the things that we came up with was that we wanted to reach children before they made mistakes and share with them what we had learned in our lifetimes so that they would never become a part of the criminal class. Everybody says this is for some reason, people think that the color of your skin is endemic or violence is ingrained in your DNA because you have a darker pigment. And that's, for lack of a better phrase, that's bullshit. Whoever you put in that situation, there are going to be some that fall by the wayside, and there will be those that persevere. It doesn't matter the color of the population. They will survive, period. They will do whatever they have to do. So when I was a child, there would be 40 and 50 of us walking to school. And it would only take us 5 minutes to get there. So we stop at the penny candy store. We go to school, and then we would follow the process in reverse to go home. As the decades passed, schools got further and further away from neighborhoods. Less and less people went to school. If you remove education and resources from neighborhoods, all that is left is children that either have parents at work or don't have parents around, who are left to their own vices, and they follow the instruction of their peers. And they end up going to prison. Once they go to prison, there's very little anybody up here on this panel can do to enrich their lives. It's not saying that they are, that we can't save them. We certainly can, but it makes it much more difficult when they've made a mistake. I can go on and on about this, but there's two other panelists, and I apologize if I got a little bit off topic.
I thought you were fantastic.
So good evening again to everyone. Just to clear up a statement that Paul made in regards to introduction, I'm not an attorney, not yet anyway. I do have my law degree, but I am not an attorney as of yet. But I am looking forward to that endeavor because there's definitely a lot of issues I think that need to be contended with in our criminal justice system in regards to people who are accused of crimes and suspected of criminal activity. But anyway, not to go into that vein for now, I definitely appreciate everything that Dr. Duck spoke about in regards to his book. If I could put things in a little bit of a personal context as well, I think everyone has kind of done that in some way. I am not from Michigan, but I am from Ohio. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I can't say that in the community that I grew up in, I did grow up in an urban setting, in an urban community. I saw a lot of poverty. I definitely bore witness to a lot of gang activity, drug activity. Unfortunately, even as a high school student, I had peers who lost their lives to gang violence and to drug activity before the age of 18. Unfortunately, I grew up in an environment where I saw a lot of death, a lot of homelessness, a lot of drugs, prostitution, a lot of the things that I think Dr. Duck was trying to allude to as well in his presentation. And I will say that all of those things can definitely factor in to the discussion, if we get in that vein, about crime and, you know, where does it manifest, where does it come from? I mean, crime is a manifestation of poverty. It is a manifestation of people's inaccessibility to housing, to employment, to educational resources and tools. And so even though I'm not from Michigan, and I can definitely speak to the experiences that I've had in Ohio, one of the things that pretty much baffled me really when I moved to Michigan and when I really started to peruse the streets of Detroit was really the blighted conditions of the communities. Seeing the fact that I could actually go down a street and it would be a residential area and there would be pockets where there were no houses, but once upon a time there was the existence of a home, or there are houses that are still standing on their foundation, but they're pretty much gutted out. And right next door is a home that is still existing, that someone still lives within. There's an inhabitant there, and they're still trying to survive and thrive in a place that is pretty much poorly conditioned. The issue of urban decay and blight conditions don't just exist in a vacuum here in the state of Michigan or in the cities and streets of Detroit. It is definitely something that we see in other places, but I guess I'm speaking to a different vein from my own experience being someone who's more of an outsider who has come here, and I can say that it was definitely one of the most puzzling things when I first bore witness to some of the conditions of the streets here in Michigan and thought about it in the context of how it can contribute directly to the issues of crime that we see manifest in this country all the time. I wanted to go back to one of the things that Dr. Duck did talk about in his presentation, and it's the issue of discretionary power and authority of law enforcement officers. I definitely believe that sometimes we take for granted the experience of people who live in these communities, the one that I just described here in the cities of Detroit, for example. I think we sometimes take for granted their perceptions and their direct views about their engagement and their interaction with law enforcement. And yes, it's very true, even from the standpoint of someone who teaches in the discipline and has a general understanding that I don't think probably is as deep as Detective Mason, because he does this work every day out here in the field. But the discretionary power is real that law enforcement officers have, but we have to also think about in the context when and where are they employing the discretionary powers and abilities that they do have. I won't draw upon my notes too much, but I did write down a quote that just really stuck with me that I got from James Baldwin. He says, "I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And so I'm going to criticize America from the standpoint of the issues of race and how it really plays a very relevant role in the discussion that we're having here today. I appreciated the fact that Dr. Duck, in his presentation, with some of the individuals that he was able to interview, there was diversity in terms of that presentation. It sounded as though one of the individuals that spoke was a younger African-American male, and one of the people that spoke was maybe a middle-aged Caucasian woman. But I don't want us to really move away from or not think about this issue of race and how it really plays in the context of what happens in inner cities and in the communities that we're talking about here, and that the racial dynamics plays a very prevalent role to the perception that people have in their interactions with law enforcement and their general understanding of what those law enforcement officers are charged with in their role. So yes, police officers they have discretion, but the issue is in terms of when they choose to employ that discretionary ability. And a lot of times in inner cities, a lot of people, their perception and the belief is that, they're not utilizing the discretionary tool because I'm Black. Again, I'm not talking as someone who's a complete outsider. I'm blessed with the amount of education and the experiences that I've been able to obtain in my life. But I come from some of these same types of communities and have bore witness to it myself and have dealt with issues of racism, even from the standpoint of how I have felt in the context of engaging and interacting with law enforcement officers. So the things that people who live in these communities, the perceptions that they have are very real, and I feel like they are very relevant discussions that we need to bear witness to and to talk about more. I feel like a lot of times people who live in inner city communities, there's not just this hopelessness or this powerlessness that they experience in and of themselves in regards to feeling like their views upon the world, people don't pay attention to them. I definitely feel like people, at least some of us anyway, give some thought and some credence to the ideas that they expound upon about their experiences in these communities, but I really feel like the discussion should be more centralized there. It's okay from an academic standpoint to be able to, tout numbers and statistics and things of that nature that people in academia love to do. But I think it really is about the raw experience of the people. And again, it goes back to my appreciation of Dr. Duck's work, because he is talking to the people in the community. He's hearing their voices and trying to gain an understanding of their experiences and how they see things through their lenses, which again, even if we go back to a discussion of the things that people in academia love, which are numbers and measurement and statistical analysis, that a lot of the things that even the individuals in the video were speaking upon can still be expounded upon from a statistical standpoint as well. So it's very real. But for me personally, even from a standpoint of being someone who teaches in criminal justice, I constantly push the discussion about race and choose to not allow us to really not think about that. I almost put the race issue in the context of how taboo it is to say the N-word, right? So you say the N-word, you don't actually say the word. I call it the R-word now when I talk to my students, racism, because even from a social media standpoint, it's not the issue that people really feel very comfortable talking about, but it's very real to the experiences of the people in these communities where we're talking about, well, why is there such high crime rates? And why is it that we have all this death and this violence that's occurring? So again, I really appreciate what you did. Thank you.
I think for myself, I feel the least worthy, if I could use that word, to be on this panel today. Of course, I've always appreciated the work of Dr. Duck and what he's done so far, just in the midst of all of the research. And Detective Mason doesn't know this, but I'm a fan. He doesn't know this because this is my first time actually having the privilege of actually meeting him. But I have most certainly just been following things that he's done and how he's been able to take his position there and go from one extreme to another in terms of from policing to actually helping the issues in community. So I'm very proud to be on this panel today. For myself, I kind of see as, you know, in the context of what I do now in the world, you know, working as a minister, right? So this is a position that is supposed to be between God and man, right? And then also working for a program called CeaseFire Detroit. I'm a special reserves officer, which is one of the higher civilian positions that you can have in the police department. And so I kind of see that as walking in between the police department and the community. Both of those in-between positions are very, very difficult. And I think that it puts me in a unique perspective just simply because that walking in between, I kind of understand both. I understand where the police department is coming from, and I feel that I have an understanding of why they do some of the things that they do, as well as having an understanding of why community residents may feel the way that they feel and express those feelings, sometimes very angrily, sometimes very frustratingly. And so just a little bit about how I got to the context of my life. My mom moved us a family of family of 9 on her side. I do have other siblings on my father's side. And just having to explain that already lets you know the difficulty of context of being a family and familial issues and how those play out even in terms of how we identify and define ourselves as people. And so 9 of us moved here from the city of Chicago simply because my mother thought that it would be safer in Detroit from running from the gang situation. Anybody know anything about Chicago? Their gangs are definitely more organized, more structured, but I don't want to say any more dangerous than those in Detroit or anywhere else in the world. And so we moved here, and I always say from the position in my family, I am next to the last of the baby boys. And so there are 6 sons, including me, there's 5 others. And so we moved here back in 1974. And at that time, I was 4 years old. And I always say to people that although I just named to you that I have all 5 brothers, all five of my brothers are gone. I don't have any brothers. And I'll explain that in the context of what I mean as I move through, you know, just some of the history of who I am. So the very first time that we moved to Detroit, came to Detroit, I grew up in the area, 48213 area on the east side of Detroit, between there and 48205. When we moved into the city of Detroit, my one block right there on Nodale Street across from French Road and the McDonald's is still there. There's not a house that remains. That block, when we moved there, it was a mixed block We had Polish families living there. We had Italian families living there. Of course, we had African-American families living there. I even remember that we had a Bengali family living on that block, which was something that was completely, I was like, what is a Bengali person? Right? It's like, this person from Bangladesh. I'm like, oh, where's that? My friend said it's on the map. I didn't know what that meant. And so in a matter of before I was 17, we were the last house on the block. No one else lived there, and all the other properties had been either burnt down or people had just sprawled away. My first interaction with the police department was we moved here, and I was 4 years old. At that time, that area is less than a mile away from the city airport, Detroit. And they used to do these things called the air show. And you could see the air show. They would put these men on top of airplanes and fly them around, make the smoke clouds, make words in the air. And it was just something spectacular for a 4-year-old to be able to witness. One of my older brothers at that time decided that we were going to walk from Gratiot and Nodale Street to the city airport, which was on Connors, right off of Gratiot. We were going to walk up there so we could firsthand witness this air show. Well, we started up Gratiot, and my older brother at that time was probably about 14. And as we started up Gratiot, we got to Connor on the western side of Gratiot, and a police car was sitting on the other side of the street. White officer turned the car around, pulled over on the side of us and said, well, where are you going? And we said, well, we're going to the air show. He said, well, where do you live? And we said, well, we just moved on Nodale Street, my older brother said. He looked in the rearview mirror and adjusted it, turned around and looked backwards. Turned and looked at us again with a very stern look and said, well, I think you boys could see that very well from your house. Now you get on back home. Don't let me see you around here anymore. So my brother said, yes, sir. And we turned around and we went home. Nothing was ever done about that, and it was never explained to me why we could not go to the city airport to see the air show. But I just recall I never made another attempt to ever try to do that again. When I was about 8 years old, starting school, I remember getting a phone call, my mother did, that as my sisters, older, were being bused into one of the schools still on the east side. School is shut down now. It's called William Robinson School. And they were being bused in. My mother, frantic, one day received a phone call, and she was told that she needed to hurry and come and get the children because they had turned over the bus on the corner of Cedar Grove and Cedar Grove and Gratiot. And so my mother frantically, because she didn't drive at the time, which is the reason that they were on the bus to be bused in the school, had to find a neighbor and see if they would take her up. And I remember her distinctly saying that she did not want to go with another African-American neighbor because she thought that would be more volatile. So she asked one of our Polish neighbors if they would take her, and they did. My sisters were retrieved, and everyone was safe from that point. At 8 years old, I remember the first time I was in class, and a white kid called me a nigger. Well, to me, it was something I didn't know I was supposed to be offended because I had heard that terminology around my household with my brothers or whatnot. So I didn't know I was supposed to be offended until someone else came up to me and said, you're supposed to punch him in the face because he called you a nigger. And I didn't understand what the big deal was at that time, again, going into this. Very first time I witnessed violent crime I probably was about 13 or 14. I was standing next to a young person. This was the time that the top 10s were in. Maybe some of you are too young to remember those, but the patent leathers with the Converse, and I see Detective is kind of smiling. He knows what those are. And you could see him a mile away if the light shined on him the right way. And I remember that my friend was wearing some, and a person came up to him and put a knife in his back and took his shoes off his feet. I could go on and on about just the atrocious things that have happened to me. I've been carjacked. My wife has been brutally raped and left for dead. We're still together now. And one of the reasons I said that I don't have any brothers is not because all of my brothers are deceased, but when I was much younger, probably at about 13, 14 years old, one of my brothers was banned from the city of Detroit because he was involved in a gang and actually had done some sort of crime where he was both told by, well, he figured from officers he would not be welcome back if he ran, but he was also told by rival gang members that if he was ever to return to Detroit, that they were going to kill the rest of his family. So he was gone at a very early age. My eldest brother was locked up when I was around the same age, probably about 15 and 16 years old. He was locked up. I have never seen him since that day that he was incarcerated because he was moved out of state and he's never returned. He received life imprisonment. I have another brother who's also incarcerated after my eldest brother was incarcerated. Same deal, life in prison, moved away. And then I have a brother who was in fact killed. That was my baby brother. He was killed, gunshot wound to the head. And then I have another brother who died, well, two brothers who passed away. And so just the format of being able to live, when I hear of the context of everything being put together in terms of criminology, what can be done, you know, all those things. I often have people that say when they hear my story, well, how could you possibly even think about working with the police department or possibly even think about doing this kind of work? And I always say, because I'd rather be a part of the solution than I would to be a part of the problem. And so it's largely the reason that I do the things that I do. This concept of when policing is derived out of a sense of privilege, a sense of poverty, a sense of policy, then I think that it is what causes communities to feel locked in, and that there is a stark difference or stark contrast between police officers and just people in the community. But as a result, to me and my race, and you know, whatever that means to people, this concept of race, I think that it is a very profound conversation to have. And I think that in context, when I look back over my life and think about race and police and all of that, what I see when I talk to residents and other community members is I get this overwhelming sense that just what we want is just to be appreciated and to have our stories appreciated, and to not have people to downplay those stories, but to just be able to at least acknowledge that there is definitely something wrong with the way that things are in this country as it relates to race, as it relates to crime, as it relates to policing in those communities. And I think I've said enough. I think I've said more than Detective did. So I'm going to stop right there and give opportunity.
Okay, and so at this time, I had one thanks I forgot to make before, actually two. One is for the program of African and African American Studies. They are also helped make this event possible. And the Chancellor's Office for Inclusion and Special Projects. I wanted to mention them as well. They helped make this event possible. So now, this is a very, you want to give them a round of applause. Thank you. And again, I think this is a discussion that I think would make Don Levin proud, and hopefully his family will be able to see this. We're recording the event today, so we'll be able to share it with others as well. But I wanted to open up the floor. A lot of very wealth of knowledge and experiences here at this table, so I wanted to open up the floor for questions from anyone, for any of our panelists, including, I'm going to hit that guy back there. Hey, Don. How you doing?
I enjoyed every speaker immensely. This was a good talk. Professor Duck touched upon briefly in his thing. Oh, and I also want to mention that I grew up in 48213. I went to Kettering. I was a Detroit police officer briefly from 1977 to 1980, way back then, cheap part. But he touched upon something that I found very interesting, and that's how courts and the fines and people are, unable to pay, so they're locked up for relatively minor crimes, and they have these huge fees, and they can't get out from under them, and it's just dragging them down worse and worse. Could you maybe?
I think at some point, and I think this starts becoming clear in terms of how we think about place and space, and how smaller municipalities fund, or even larger places fund city government and law enforcement, and where those budgets are coming from. I think we need to sort of take a step back, and I think the bishop said something that was really interesting, or not only interesting, but I thought was profound, that is something being done on a policy level related to poverty or related to privilege. And we need to think about how these fees are sort of exacerbating, making things worse for a lot of poor populations. And I think if we look at something which I think became very clear in the Ferguson report, that this was one of the ways that the city government was finding creative ways of funding it itself. And I think this is why it's important to study both larger places and smaller places. That and let me just put this out there in the universe, that I think now we have so much access to information where we can look at a map and look at where our populations are coming from in terms of prison populations in smaller and rural areas. We can see how things like arrests, but also things like overdoses are clustering in smaller places. I think now we need to start turning our lens to seeing what's at play structurally that's creating a situation where someone, an American citizen, would be sanctioned with $2,400 or $2,200 in fees, and those sanctions would create a situation where this person can potentially go to prison. And I think that's very, very telling. And so I guess the quick and dirty way to answer your question, I think more work needs to be done looking at smaller municipalities and how they fund and, take care of themselves. And I also think there needs to be an understanding of what happens when industry leaves and the tax base is eroded. What are the creative ways that, smaller municipalities are coming up with to pay for services like law enforcement and city government?
Just to add to that, if I'm not mistaken, didn't the Supreme Court put out a memorandum or something on that that was supposed to trickle down to the lower courts about, that they should find alternate ways of, imposing penalties, rather than fines?
I can't speak to that, but I do know that there was something about, especially at the establishment of our government, about not sending people to prison over debt. And we had outlawed debtors' prisons. And so even, thinking about how have we gotten to a point where someone can be incarcerated for their failure to pay their fines and fees, I think needs to be evaluated. I wish I knew about the Supreme Court case, but I apologize, I do not know about that case.
And I'd like to weigh in on that just briefly. Even when you start looking at how these things become or are made, community members are made aware of these types of policy changes. For example, here in Michigan, Michigan's driver's responsibility fee, right? So this thing hits you, it's actually the very first time and last, I'm prophesying that I've ever seen the inside of a jail cell, right? Is because I paid my tickets off and I was under the impression once I received my letter that everything was good. Was pulled over on the side of the road out in one of our suburban areas. And he came up and he said, well, yes, you did pay your tickets. Yes, you did pay your first year driver's responsibility fee. What you didn't know was that there's 2 years of driver's responsibilities fee. And that after that, for 3 months, in order to teach you a lesson, to make sure that you don't get this kind of thing again, they're going to put your license in suspension for 3 months. And you won't. So it's like, what am I supposed to do from there? Now, even though later on this gets kicked all the way up to the courts and it was deemed unconstitutional, right? But still, in retrospect, those persons who already had the debt still have to pay the debt, right? And so I think it goes a lot to what Dr. Duck is saying in terms of getting in and being able to see and affect and impact how they can make those dollars without imposing those things, because that was their response as to why they came up with the driver's responsibility fee, because our roads need to be fixed and all these other things. And it was like, yeah, but that's unconstitutional, and we didn't even know that it was happening until actually it happened. So it's being paid by.
If I could just add to it just a little bit as well, not so much in the vein about the driver responsibility fees, but thinking about pretrial detainees, so people who are placed behind bars simply because they can't pay the fines or what have you to get out. And maybe this might be something that might be on people's radar as well right now. And if I throw out the name Khalif Browder, does that name ring a bell to people? Is that a case that we're familiar with, right? Khalif Browder was a young man. There's actually a documentary being shown right now about his life. He was 16 years old at the time that he was picked up off the streets by a law enforcement officer because they believed that he had been taking part in a robbery, essentially stealing of a backpack. And Khalif Browder, following the cop and going with the cop to the police precinct, believing that eventually, before the end of the day, he would be released, ended up finding himself on Rikers Island for the next 3 years, simply because he could not pay to get out of jail because his family couldn't afford the cost. And unfortunately, the fact that he couldn't pay the cost to get out, and he spent 3 years on Rikers Island never being convicted of a crime, 2 years upon his release, he took his own life. So the pretrial detention issue is a very serious problem that we have within our judicial system. I would say that in regards to issues of bail, that a component of it that we sometimes lose access to thinking about is the access to justice component, which has less to do with race and more to do with economic wherewithal. So essentially, our court system, unfortunately, operates in many ways where it's not about your culpability and your involvement with a crime. It's more about your financial capability to pay the cost to get out of jail. And unfortunately, we have a system where we do have an access to justice concern when we talk about people's right to counsel. Your very first hearing when you get picked up off the street by a police officer is your arraignment hearing. And when you go to court on arraignment, even though you do have a right to counsel under the Sixth Amendment protected interest, it doesn't necessarily pick up at that arraignment hearing. And that arraignment hearing, the only thing most people are concerned about at that particular point is, am I going to be able to make bail? Am I going to get a bail? And am I going to be able to post it so that I can get out of jail, so I can essentially try to build my case for myself and essentially try to get rid of these charges? So if we're dealing with a situation where, yes, we have a Sixth Amendment protected right and access to counsel, but it doesn't necessarily pick up until a later part of the proceeding, then that in and of itself, too, plays a role in terms of our response to bail issues. I actually used to work for Third Circuit Court, and I can tell you, I have attested to it. I've sat in courtrooms during the arraignment process, and I've bore witness to individuals who were able to retain counsel and pay the cost that same day for very serious and egregious crimes. We're talking vehicular homicide, murder, and because they could retain counsel, because they could pay for it outright then and there, that they were able to walk out of jail that day. Not even on a fine, not even in some of those cases, not even on a paid fine, monetary bond, but on a personal bond. Because they had an attorney present, because there was rapport and relationship perhaps between that judge or magistrate with that counselor, because there was belief, there was trust, if you will, in belief in that attorney's ability to ensure that that individual returned to court. So again, it goes back to this concern, financial capability versus criminal culpability, if you will, in regards to a crime. It's not really about that in our system, and unfortunately, that is why we have a situation where so many people are sitting behind bars, and we have these cases of people like the Khalif Browder who spent 3 years incarcerated for a crime that he was never convicted for, simply because they could not pay.
I think this gentleman.
Here and here.
So my question goes to the detective. I don't know about Detroit's police department, but like other departments that make the news lately, like the Ferguson Police Department. The makeup of the department does not necessarily reflect the community social makeup. Do you think if police departments reflected the community social makeup and help reduce police brutality and increase the trust among the community and the police department?
All right. So the makeup of the Detroit Police Department is predominantly black, right? How do I explain this? if me and you speak English, right, that doesn't mean that we can still communicate, right? So if I come to your neighborhood and I've never been to your neighborhood before, there are certain sayings and phrases that you use that are English. I assume I know what they mean, but I don't, right? So as far as police brutality goes, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the race of the officer or the citizen. It has to do with the level of respect and understanding on both sides, right? So if I'm dealing with a population that has been undereducated, right, and I'm dealing with a police force, and I'm not speaking about my own, and I'm dealing with a police force that has a perception of the population where maybe that police officer is young in his or her career and believes that they are better than the population that they serve. If the police officer has forgotten that the reason they came on the job was to serve the public, then you're going to have issues, right? That is his or her main goal, is to serve the public. That is the oath that they swear. They didn't swear, the initial oath is not to protect each other. It is to protect the community in which they serve, right? And so if we forget that, then we end up with these massive problems, right? Did I answer your question?
Yes, I actually do have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
I guess would the community be more trusting of if their police department was viewed from their community? Let's say in terms of, like as we saw in Dr. Duck's presentation, the second interviewer said, police go after petty crimes instead of the major criminals. Would, let's say, the police department reflected that community, would there be more trust where people can tell about these criminals and not fear retaliation?
Is that
Can I-
to me or
Okay.
to Dr. Duck?
I'm going to say this, and this is going to be a hard thing to say. First, I want to thank these three panelists because they've been absolutely fantastic, and this has been totally rewarding and moving for me. Now, with that being said, that one of the things that I am very clear of what's going on in that space, that in communities like the one I studied, and I would make the argument that even in places like Detroit, everyone's under pressure. The schools are under pressure. The teachers are under pressure. The social workers, the probation, parole officers, and law enforcement is under under extreme pressure. And I think and then the pressure sort of creates situations where law enforcement has to function in the role of a social worker instead of, investigating and solving crimes. Or it creates a situation where, a teacher has to go into their personal savings to do their job when these are things that the state's supposed to do. Now, saying this all to say, I do think that we forget that these are institutions, and institutions with a bureaucracy and the way that they hire and the way that they police or educate or employ people in these spaces. I think in some instances, anyone who was a known figure and that people can sort of have a relationship where it's not punitive and there is something in terms of accountability and reciprocity in the ways that these officers are regulated. I think that is something to sort of think about in terms of building a more equitable situation. With that being said, I think one of the things that we have to be very knowledgeable of is that what is the overall makeup of these places in terms of why they're in the dire straits that they're in. And so it becomes, it starts upon us to think about why are certain people being treated differently by the justice system? Why is there such a lack of livable wages? What does it mean to have affordable housing? What does it mean to have a quality education? So these are all questions that regardless of who you are, once you start and go into those spaces, that you're going to have to deal with these sort of larger macro issues. And then once you look around and feel that the money and see that the money is scarce, then you start seeing that, the heroes and the victims become really ambiguous because everyone's struggling, everyone's under pressure. And I think that's the unfortunate part about sort of taking a step back and doing this sort of work. I would love to say that I have a silver bullet solution. Do I think it would help if, states that employed or cities that employed people had more people working, living in their communities? I think that would be great if more resources were in those spaces. But I think where we are right now is that there's so many issues that we haven't addressed that are a byproduct of globalization and deindustrialization and how we are going to figure out how we're going to fund our economy moving forward, that those are some of the wider issues that we have to have a discussion about. And I think a lot of people who live in these communities know that there's something inherently wrong with the way that the system runs and the way that the system functions.
Before moving on too, I think that answering that question from a community perspective too is vital, because when you speak of persons in the community being reflected in the police department, just because people live in the same space doesn't necessarily mean that they're a part of that particular community. And I think that it's sometimes unfair from a community standpoint to expect, the police department to be a reflection of them when there are people who live in the same space of a contextualized community that I don't even reflect myself. Do I want, my community police officers to reflect Pookie and Ray Ray that's selling drugs? No, I do not. Do I want them to reflect Pookie and Ray Ray that's robbing people and sticking them up? No, I do not. I think that when you get into that kind of definition of what the community really is and expecting, the definition to match a police department, you kind of get into a Hollywood ideology of Training Day, meets Detroit, right? And I think it's so important to, that when we ask those questions about community and police reflection of community, that the community must also be honest about what are they defining as their community.
Let me, may I?
Yeah, I wanted to get to make sure we had this young man here, and then who else I had it over here? Okay, a few over here. So, boom, 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 boom.
I needed to add to that. The population of the department does not necessarily need to reflect the community. The department needs to understand, and the officers need to understand that they're dealing with human beings. And as long as they understand that and they treat the population accordingly, then we won't have any problems. Yes. But officers are individuals, just like people are individuals. Sometimes they make bad decisions. A lot of times they make bad decisions. And sometimes they make good ones. But if we treated everyone as human beings and recognized everyone as our equal, then we have a lot less problems, right? And so as far as whether you need to live in the area that you police, I did live in the area that I police. Right? And I chose to move close to number 9 because I would only be a couple minutes away from work, right? And I drove my kids all the way across town to go to school. My kids couldn't play in the front yard. They couldn't play in the backyard. People tried to break into my house while I was protecting everybody else. So I bought a dog. They tried to steal my dog. So I got another dog, right? And she was so vicious and mean that I didn't have any problems, right? So my wife calls and she says, hey, they're shooting in the backyard. So I call my buddies because I'm busy. Hey, can you please go check on my wife? No, we can't because we're busy. So while I'm protecting everybody else, who's protecting my family? Do I stay or do I go? I leave. I love Detroit, right? That's why I'm doing what I do now. It's way more than policing, but shouldn't this be policing? Right? If I'm supposed to be serving the community and I'm supposed to be serving the citizens, the best way I can serve them is to make sure that they never make these mistakes. Right? That's policing. It's not seeing how many people you can put in fucking prison. Who was next?
We discussed a lot of issues about the problems of communities and places like Detroit and everything, but nationally overall, crime has been going down at a pretty steady rate over the last few decades. is it because the police have been better at doing their jobs? And it kind of sounds like the police really have this warped sense of priorities of just putting people away and warehousing people to solve a problem. But data shows that crime is going down. Is that the reason why?
The police department and police departments are a reaction to issues, right? And those issues that cause crime have to do with the lack of education and resources. If you deplete those resources and those forms of education from neighborhoods, you will see crime spike. That is a fact. As long as there's a population in that area, crime will spike. There's no way around that. And so police still have to do their job. If you break the law and you kill somebody, you will be held accountable. However, there's a saying in law enforcement: you cannot arrest your way out of that problem. And it is so true. You can't. You can educate your way out of this issue, but for some reason, there are decisions that are being made way above my pay grade and way outside the police department that continue to deplete areas of educational opportunities, right? And if I have to feed my family, I'm gonna do whatever I have to do to feed my family, right? So when I go home at the end of the day and I take off my uniform, if I'm wearing a uniform, I'm still a black man. And however black men are treated in this country, that's how I'm gonna be treated until they realize I'm the police. And when they realize I'm the police, then they're gonna treat me different. I don't want that for my kids. I don't. I wish it was different. And the only way it can be different is if we speak up. And so I speak, and so the doctor speaks, and so Ebonie speaks, and the bishop speaks, and we'll continue to speak. I hope I answered your question.
So my question was, well, really more of a statement, because as I was listening to the young lady tell her story about the tickets, that was a big thing, how many fines she had. But then you had the brother speaking on the difference. It was a big difference. One of the things that I noticed was, and even throughout, I'm from South Memphis, I moved up here years ago, I got my degree from U of M. But the difference in the woman and the man being perceived as a threat, because I got pulled over. I remember when I was 17, an old guy passed away. He gave me an 85 Cutlass. I got rid of that car 2 weeks later.
Right.
I got pulled over 17 times in 12 days, simply because I was driving that car. It was perceived as a drug dealer car, especially in the neighborhood. So my question is really, how do you guys, just an open question for the panel, how do you guys think we change the mindset? Because with so many negatives working against us, the media, they put the perceived mindset that a black man is this, and the only way that they do that is because every time you turn on the news, it's one of us holding up a sign, this person did this person did this. Now, being in the military, I didn't start getting respect from the police until I started showing that military ID. So it was a big, massive difference in how I got treated. Like you said, when you find out you're a police officer, now it's really different. Because now the mindset is, okay, yeah, you serve, you protect us. No. If I didn't have this, you're gonna pull me over, you're gonna treat me the exact same way you would have treated my brother, who's only 17. So how do we deal with this? Because the reality is, no matter how much, we're still fighting a losing battle when it comes to television. Because television programming is what's programming everything. I just had a conversation with a Muslim friend of mine. He was like, yeah, things are so bad and things are this, because of a lot of things being said in the media from President Trump, about the Muslim bans and things of that nature. But I was just like, we had a conversation 2 years ago, and you said that if Mike Brown didn't do this. So now it's just like, now you hear people saying, well, if Muslims don't do this, if they take off their scars, if they cut their beards, they do all this, there's no real solution. So my question is, how do we change the mindset?
Okay. How do we change perception? From the time we're born, we're bombarded with images that teach us how to behave, right? Who to live with, what to wear, what to buy, where to go to school, right? To a large degree, if you do not have guidance, those images take over a massive part of your life, and they shape your understanding of the world, correct? Okay, If you got proper parenting and people that you can lean on that will give you advice, those images are not as powerful, but they're still powerful. Everybody in this room has a cell phone. Almost everybody in this room probably has access to social media and is on social media. That's how you began to change how we're perceived. You also speak out. Don't sit in the corner or remain silent and hope that somebody speaks for you. You need to speak, right? I didn't always speak like this. I'm 40 years old. If I'd have been doing this 20 years ago, the world might be different. But hopefully, when I speak, there's 40 more people to speak and 40 more people after that. You have to say something. This is a time unlike any other in this nation where you guys had the power to reach so many people with a singular device that you carry in your pocket, right? That cell phone has a camera. You can shape the way you want to be seen. That's part of the program that we have. That's part of the program that we employed in Kenya and here in Detroit, right? You can shape the way that you want to be seen. If you're intelligent, show it. Just because you sell dope don't mean everybody need to know that you sell dope, right? Nobody needs to know that. That is ridiculous, right? And so, how do I put this? If I put a camera in the hands of a child, you get to see the world from their perspective. They get to create their own heroes and their own images to aspire to. So instead of being conditioned to follow a brand like Jordan for the rest of their lives, they become the brand that others follow and our future leaders. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I'm just asking.
That's it.
Can
I want to add. Oh,
Go ahead.
you want to?
I'll be really
Yes,
quick.
go
I
ahead.
just, I think for me, one of the ways, I'm going to sound cliche, right? When I say education, we talk about it, have these open dialogues, but it's so true. I mean, it really is the foundation of where we have to begin to move forward because, as I stated earlier, when we talk about racism, people get very uncomfortable by the term racism. People get a little more comfortable if we term it as white privilege, right? Because it takes away a little bit of responsibility from people. But if we say that there's intentional acts of racism in our country and we need to address those and we need to talk about them, people get very uncomfortable. But education is really the foundation. You educated this entire room just a moment ago just talking about your experience. Yeah. Who would have known that had you not opened up and began that dialogue? I went real quick. I went and saw this past weekend Roland Martin and Jane Elliott speak. And she is like a feisty woman if you don't know who Jane Elliott is. And the thing that she said that really stuck out to me the most is she said, I formed it into a quote, may not have been a quote, but she said, racism is an intentional, it's an intentional motivation to want to be engaged. I'm screwing it up. Racism is the intentional engagement in an emotional relationship with ignorance, right? So if we're choosing to be ignorant, if we want to continue to, combat the wall or not even combat it, but not want to address the issue of racism when it comes head on to our attention, then we're choosing to remain in that darkness and we're not going to be able to progress and move forward. We're not going to be able to protect, Detective Mason's children that he's talking about, who he wants to safeguard from having to deal with the things that we're dealing with today. So education, I know it's the cliche thing that people say, but it's so true. Utilizing your platform and being able to dialogue with people and be raw and real and uncut about what's really happening. And let's stop sugarcoating it.
Okay. I want to make sure we had Kate. Yes. I wanted to tell people we are officially overtime. That doesn't bother me, but I just want to let you know if you do need to leave, I'm not going to stop you. But I think we've got some more questions over here. I want to get to the two young ladies over here. I'm going to start by the wall and move over here. And then we've got a question on this side. Yes. Oh. Oh, you were next. Okay, can we have the questions real fast, like all three questions, and we'll throw it to the panel? Okay, go ahead.
Real quick, I'm trying to be an economist, developing economist, okay? So, to me, this is very important with what's actually happening here. Because, yes, a lot of times developing economists work on trying to improve other countries that are, poverty-stricken, but it also can improve our own situations, which is pretty much urban areas that are getting taken for the food. pretty much. And as long as they care, as long as the economist cares. He said something that was very important to me that we just heard in class today. Your family came from the South, okay? And pretty much for the factories up here that were supposedly supposed to be here, for work that was taken away from the cotton pickers down there, that the machines took your jobs. And then you came up here just to be surplus labor, so that way that the owners of the companies, the factory companies here, can actually take power away from the worker, which means low wages, trapping people in communities who they choose to be trapped in communities. Now, personally, I just want to know how you feel on the effects that actual economists can play with helping sociologists make a difference.
Okay, you got that question down? How economists can help sociologists? I don't know if there's any way. Okay, I want to get to the questions and then we'll put it to everybody. Yes.
I had two different things to say. First, I'll be very short. I seen a movie years ago when I was a kid, and it was back in the 70s. I guess the movies that they played were shot in Chicago or New York. And the white cop, or he was a lieutenant or something, and he told the rookies, he said, I thought I told you guys to put the dope in the ghetto. So pertaining to some of the questions of why, not impoverished families, but black neighborhoods or black families, that was meant to break up our neighborhoods. And the second thing I wanted to say, racism still exists. You could be educated, you could still be educated, you could get stopped, and you could be a lawyer, actor, we're still getting stopped. But my thing is to say, like, the oppression, it's like we're still being oppressed, black people as a whole. I mean, I'm not talking about the ones that made it or, have a good life, but if you can't afford, I just think it's so unfair if you don't work or you can't afford to pay your way for a ticket and you would go to jail or you get picked up for something and you were with someone, and then you get railroaded into jail for all these years. What can we do about that?
Okay. You got those two? And then right here.
I'll be super quick, but there is an argument that police, not individuals, but police as an institution, was created to maintain oppressive systems. So historically in the United States, police were created to enforce the slave system, segregation, and today colorism, racism, etc., because it's inherent in our system. It's what the United States was built on. And so I think it's understandable for communities to never ever trust police. Do you believe that there is a possibility for societies to truly practice community policing, or is the police institution inherently oppressive?
By community policing, you mean the communities policing themselves? Is that what you're talking about?
So then I guess my follow-up to that would be based on your answer, because I'm hoping it's positive, but what does good policing look like? What does a system that enforces good community policing actually look like in reality? And how can we implement it in real time?
Okay, good. And then, Paris, did you want to throw yours in the pot too?
Yeah, I'm going to get back to the community part of it with Dr. Duck. Very interested in urban ethnography. That is my thing. But I wanted to find out, because the neighborhood knows what it wants, good or bad, and what it will tolerate. What I wanted to find out is while you were doing your research, what were the community support systems there to rebuild the community? Because I understand, I was looking at the neighborhood and also looking at your former neighborhood, because your former neighborhood looks like my former neighborhood, and what the community supports were looking like, because a lot of times community supports are put into these social charitable organizations, but how much are they empowering the people to change their own neighborhoods? And did you see any of that while in your research?
Okay, so that's like 4 different questions, and it's one, so one for each of you. So why don't you go ahead and each just pick one to respond to. You already started, so go ahead, Khary.
All right. So, as far as community policing goes, let's dissect Michigan, right? If we dissect Michigan, let's go to Oakland County. Oakland County is very well-to-do. The police look different in Oakland County. They dress different in Oakland County. People in Oakland County make more money and they're better educated, right? There's no deficit as far as education goes in Oakland County. There's a deficit as far as education goes in Detroit. The police look different. Some wear uniforms. Some look like they're in the military, right? The policing tactics are different, right? So as far as community policing goes in Detroit, and with any other place, you get to know the neighborhood that you're in. You get to know the people that you serve. But if education is not a high component of changing the neighborhood, the policing will stay the same, right? You have to ensure the educational resources come back to the city. If they don't, you're going to continue to have these problems. And the more of a deficit you have with regard to education, the worse the problems get. So I don't know if I totally answered your question. Did I? Do you have a follow-up? Well, then please.
I'm actually the student body president here.
Okay.
I'm meeting with the deputy chief on campus. And so it's very important that I bring to him what good policing and community policing actually looks like in practice. So like based on your research, what have you found are the most effective policing methods that can be implemented on an institutional level?
Okay. Good policing looks like, hi, how are you doing today? Can I help you? Right? That's good policing. Having a conversation with the populace that you serve. That is good policing. And if you do that every day, then all of a sudden, Miss Jenkins down the street, 4 doors down, you're rolling past, Miss Jenkins says, hey, I think somebody's breaking in Mr. Brown's house. He's at work. Right? That's good policing. Right? You have to know the community that you serve. If you roll past in a scout car and you don't say anything to anybody, but you see somebody running and you start chasing them, right? And you arrest them, and that's all you do every time you come down the street, the populace is not going to trust you because every time they see you, you're chasing somebody. And maybe that kid is just running to the store, right, for his mother. You must know the community that you serve. If you do not, if you don't know them, they don't know you. They make assumptions, and so do you. I hope I answered.
I think you said it earlier, though, just respect for humanity and respect for people. I mean, that is good policing. See, a lot of times we make this distinction as if police are like robots programmed, and therefore they're not human. The element is that whatever positioning that you're taking to work, if you treat people like people, that's the best way to do it. Rules without relationship equates rebellion. If I'm just always constantly on the rules, but we don't have a relationship, then obviously that person is probably going to rebel. They're going to be more likely to do that. So I think that in all honesty, just packing everything that he just said with the foundation of what he said earlier, it's really about empathy and respect, being able to see people as people, knowing that you're a person as well. And I think that's good policing. That's good being a good lawyer. That's being a good minister. That's being a good academician. That's being a good person. And I think it's all the same.
Okay, so I'm just going to answer the three. So I think sociologists and economists work together all the time. I think just the direction that these two disciplines are going into are qualitatively different in terms of who is the average PhD student in an econ program and how many of those students are really concerned about wider policy issues. Every so often, there's a book like the French economist Piketty, Capital, will come out and make a commentary about the distribution of wealth in this country. I think these are things that are important. In terms of neighborhood supports, now remember when I say everyone's under pressure? I think one of the problems is when you have a pocket of money from a few funders, is that everyone's scrambling to compete for those funds. And so I think that creates a sort of a bottleneck effect, where you would, I don't think intentionally, but you would discredit another agency if you think it'll get you better footing. One of the things that I think is really significant that, as a sociologist, that I probably didn't take, I wouldn't say that I didn't take it seriously, but I think it was more important than I initially thought, was the amount of space and sort of what's at the foundation for a lot of faith-based organizations. So if you think about places that have gyms and schools and libraries and after-school programs that are sort of community-tied, that a lot of these churches have those spaces. And then if you were to ask someone, and this was one of the things about even how we think about missionaries across space and time at a particular historical moment, why are you in this space? And it's because it's my calling that I've been called to work here in this space. That there's something about the moral order of why people are in those spaces and sort of the infrastructure that religious organizations have in terms of turning these communities around that the state doesn't have. And so here, those were beautiful buildings where Grant Middle School, Elementary School, Law, Lynch, all these beautiful school buildings that are closed, are not being utilized. But you have a lot of churches and faith-based organizations that are sort of absorbing those after-school programs in their spaces. And even, drug treatment programs, the church has been really influential in these spaces. Now back to, you've been really patient, and I think what's happening is an abomination, that we haven't, to even ask the question. And I think the question is, how is it that someone can find themselves in an unfortunate situation because they don't have enough money to live? And this becomes really profound, that your whole entire life can be restructured and changed. That this isn't something that, that is, something that is, a single case, that this is happening all over the place. And even the way that we do surveillance in this country has changed, that there's no reason why someone should be, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I'm sorry. Do you think, though, to me it seems though like it is sort of a way to oppress, the black culture?
I wouldn't say, I would go so far and say that any group of people who don't have the ability to sort of regulate and hold people accountable for their practices runs the risk of being oppressed. And because if we look at the history of black people in this country, and from the kidnapping to the Middle Passage to slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to even after being declared as legal citizens and still having amendments that say that we are, quote unquote, humans, citizens, beings, that we still have these problems. Meaning that there's something much more, there's a larger systemic problem. Now, how we talk about race and racism is really important. Because for a lot of people, we have to understand how that history, as a black American, my history is indexed to all of those things that I've mentioned. My disparities with regards to wealth is sort of indexed to all of those things. My interaction, if you think that I am not deserving, that challenge that I will present to you as somebody who's trying to keep me from living up to my full potential is where the racism comes in. And so I think looking at how groups of people are systematically disenfranchised, and I think doing this type of work is extremely important. That, we didn't have these conversations that the gentleman here pointed out that, crime rates have gone down. But we've actually sort of seen how whether we have 7+ million people under surveillance, whether we have 2 million people in prisons or jails, all of these things have changed. But what I guess I'm saying to you is that we have to understand how these things come into being and deconstruct it, but also point out that disproportionate populations, whether they're Black and Latino populations, are being affected by these policies. And for whites who think that this doesn't impact them, the United States has the highest white prison population in the world. So this is something that's happening all over the place. But yes, it is disproportionately impacting minority populations, particularly Black and Latino.
They said Blacks and Latinos.
Blacks and Latinos, and we have the highest white population of any industrialized country in the world. In prison and jail.
And that number makes sense because, we oftentimes, I grew up in Detroit. And so for me, in the 70s and the 80s, to walk into a classroom and to see myself surrounded by, the majority of African-American students, and then to have this one or two possible white students in, that was kind of the typical, right? And so it was very easy to not think that we were the minority as a people. Imagine my surprise leaving out of Detroit and going into other parts of the country or the world, and you begin to see, wait a minute, this is why they say we're the minority in America, because we really are outnumbered. And I think a lot of times it's easy for those of us whom have the Black experience to kind of forget that we're still the minority in this country. And so whatever is happening to us, if it's on an even keel like prison, it would be more, even if it's disproportionate or disproportionate in size, it still would be more of them because it's more of them.
Can I just quickly disagree?
Oh, okay.
And throw out a number of statistics. So we are 5% of the world population, the United States. We have 25%, that's a quarter of our population, in prison. In regards to the numbers of Black, white, Latino, Black people are 13% of the population, but we're 60 to 70% of the prison population. So I want to make sure, that's my understanding, maybe it might be wrong, different. But that's my understanding, and that is what makes it so significant, is the fact that we are a smaller portion of this country's population, but we make up the majority of people behind prison walls. There's this permanent underclass that we have in place in this country because of mass incarceration. The permanent underclass is you're not going to be able to move up to another class structure, because once you've been introduced to that particular system, you are barred in many senses from employment opportunities. You're barred from the ability to go out and vote. You're barred from educational access. So it's a very deeply rooted systemic problem. I know I tout the issue of race a lot because it's really a critical component to what we're talking about in this criminal justice system. But I don't want anybody to walk away from this discussion.
I hope it didn't come across that I was saying that this wasn't a problem.
Me either.
I
didn't either. No.
Because I think that the young lady was confused by your statement as to white people being
I think what I was trying...
Was that your understanding? I wanted to clear that up.
I wanted to make sure what I'm saying is that we have one of the highest prison populations in the world. In addition to having high Black and Latino populations, I think as you provided numbers, that even our white population is one of the highest incarcerated white populations in the world. That's the only thing.
And that's what I was backing up. I wasn't saying, I'm saying the exact same thing you're saying. The reason it's a problem is because of the disproportionate amount of African Americans and Latinos who are in prison. But I'm saying that the prison problem is a problem for this country overall, because in comparison, this country, whoever you put in that prison population, in comparison this country with other countries, we are still dramatically higher than most other countries. And so I think that the overarching problem is that we have a problem with this country in terms of prison reform anyway. And then as you get into the deeper span of what that problem looks like, it begins to affect us the most because of the disproportionate sizes of it. That's what I would.
So we're all on the same page.
So
yeah, we were saying.
Okay.
I just want to be
same page.
My mama might watch this and
Right.
she look at it and said,
I saw that left eye go up.
in
Like,
prison no more.
I'm like, oh no, no.
Well, I'm going to take the facilitator's prerogative and draw our event to a close, because I know we have a crew that's been here taping. They've been here since 3 o'clock this afternoon, I think, getting ready for this. So we want to let them go home. Yeah, give them a hand, please. I did want to, apropos of this last thought, I want to actually read. This is a brand new publication, Sociological Focus, a journal, an esteemed sociology journal, publication of the North Central Sociological Association. And in the brand new issue, there's an article by Ann Warfield Rawls and Waverly Duck. And there was a line from this that really I thought was apropos of this discussion. In this era of mass incarceration, in which the stigma and fear of the black man as criminal and thug serves as justification to many Americans for the multiple daily shootings of unarmed citizens by the police and the incarceration of young children for misbehaving in elementary schools, it is time for a new understanding of where racism lives and how it operates. And I think this is what we're getting at, is to go to the next level, is not just to say racism is real. There are people that still have a problem believing that. We have to move beyond just saying racism is real and racism is a problem, and actually analyzing, understanding how it operates and the ways in which it operates. And that's how we move towards trying to intervene and do something about it. I want to thank this wonderful panel and all of you for being here. And good night. And we'll be here to talk, but this event is now officially over. Thank you.